On the afternoon of Friday, the 7th of February, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Lunet was in her kitchen clearing away the plates from lunch. Her house was in a quiet suburb in Cunha, France, and it was the kind of place where not much ever happened. Her husband, Claude, and two of her adult sons, Frank and Pascal, were still sitting at the table talking amongst themselves. They were getting ready to leave for an overnight trip. The plan was to drive about 3.5 hours to a town near Paris for a big family gathering. It was a retirement party for Claude's sister-in-law, and it was supposed to be a happy occasion. But Monique wasn't going. She had told everyone that somebody needed to stay behind to look after their 4 dogs, and that was true. But there was another reason, a much bigger one, that she was staying home. She just really did not get along with her husband's side of the family. The whole situation was complicated. Monique and Claude had gotten married almost 20 years earlier. It was a second marriage for both of them, and they came into it with a lot of baggage, specifically a lot of kids. Monique had 3 boys from her first marriage, and Claude had 5 girls. At first, it was like a real-life Brady Bunch. The two halves of this new blended family seemed to get along just fine. But as time went on, things started to get tense. The personalities just didn't mesh, especially between Monique and her 5 new stepdaughters. When she and Claude had tied the knot, all 5 of his daughters were already teenagers or in their early 20s. So while they accepted Monique into their lives, they never really saw her as a mother figure. They were already very close with their own mother, Claude's ex-wife, a woman named Beatrice. To them, Beatrice was their mom, and Monique was just their dad's new wife. Then, about 10 years before, in 1993, something happened that completely shattered the fragile peace. One of Claude's grandsons, so the child of one of his daughters, had accused Monique's eldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexually abusing him. The accusation was never reported to the police, so there was no official investigation, no charges, nothing. It was just a family matter. But it was an explosive one. Claude's 5 daughters and his ex-wife Beatrice all completely believed the grandson. Monique, on the other hand, fiercely defended her son Jean-Luc. She was adamant that he would never do such a thing. Claude was caught in the middle, torn between his wife and his daughters. The fallout was ugly. It got so bad that the two sides of the family just stopped speaking to each other entirely for a whole year. Now, fast forward to 2003, and they were all back on speaking terms, but it was just that, speaking terms. The air was still thick with tension and resentment whenever they all got together. It was uncomfortable for everyone involved. And that was the real reason Monique wasn't going to the retirement party. It was also why her son, Jean-Luc, the one at the center of the old accusation, wasn't going either. It was just easier for everyone if they stayed away. So, around 3 in the afternoon, as Claude, Frank, and Pascal wheeled their suitcases out to the car, Monique followed them to the front door. She gave them each a hug and a kiss goodbye, told them to have fun, and then she stood in the doorway and watched as they got into the car and drove off down the street, leaving her alone in the quiet house with the dogs. A few hours passed. The sun started to set. Around 6:30 in the evening, Monique heard a knock on her front door. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened it, she saw her son, Jean-Luc, standing on the porch holding his bicycle. He told her he was just on his way home from work and decided to stop by for a quick visit. She was happy to see him and told him to come on in. Jean-Luc leaned his bike against the side of the house and walked inside. As he was taking off his coat in the hallway, he mentioned something to his mom. He said that as he was riding up to the house, he noticed their neighbor from across the street, a man named Henri, was staring at him. He said it was weird, like Henri was spying on him. This actually spooked Monique a little bit. Henri wasn't just a nosy neighbor. He was known in the neighborhood for being a bit of a loose cannon. He had this bizarre obsession with people parking in front of his house. If anyone dared to park their car on the public street in front of his property, Henri would shamelessly vandalize it. He'd slash their tires or pour oil all over the car. He just didn't care who saw him do it. Over the years, Monique and her sons had gotten into several screaming matches with Henri over parking. One of those arguments had even turned into a full-blown physical fight. So the idea of him watching the house was unsettling. But since Jean-Luc had come on his bike and there was no car to trigger Henri's rage, Monique just hoped he would leave them alone. She led Jean-Luc into the kitchen and poured them both a glass of sparkling wine. They sat at the kitchen table and just chatted for about half an hour, catching up on things. After they finished their drinks, Monique offered to give him a haircut, so he sat in a chair while she trimmed his hair, just a normal, quiet mother-son evening. Around 7:05, Jean-Luc said he had to get going. His wife was waiting for him at their apartment for dinner. He gave his mom a hug, said goodbye, and went back outside. He grabbed his bike, which thankfully was still untouched by Henri, got on, and rode off into the evening. After he was gone, Monique went about her routine. She gathered the 4 dogs and put them behind a baby gate they kept at the bottom of the staircase to keep them contained. She filled their bowls with food, and then she went back into the kitchen to start cooking dinner for herself. A little while later, around 7:30, she heard another knock at the front door. She knew it couldn't be Jean-Luc again. As she walked down the long hallway to answer it, she had a knot in her stomach, just hoping it wasn't Henri, ready to start another argument. The next morning, the woman who lived in the house right next door to Monique woke up feeling groggy and tired. She hadn't slept well at all. All night long, some dogs in the neighborhood had been barking non-stop, and it had kept her up. She got out of bed and walked over to her bedroom window, pulling open the blinds. Sunlight flooded into the room, making her squint. As her eyes adjusted, she glanced down from her second-floor window into the yard of the 2-story white house next door, Monique's house. And that's when she saw something. There was a dark shape lying in the middle of the paved walkway that led up to Monique's front door. It looked out of place. The neighbor pressed her face against the glass, squinting to get a better look. And then her heart stopped. She realized what she was seeing. It was a body, lying face down on the pavement. In a total panic, the woman stumbled back from the window, ran out of her room, grabbed the phone, and frantically dialed the police. A couple of hours later, Judiciary Police Captain Ann P. pulled her car up in front of the white 2-story house. The street was already blocked off with crime scene tape, and a medical examiner's van was parked out front. As Captain P got out of her car, another officer approached her and led her toward the front yard, to where the body of a woman was still lying on the walkway. The officer explained that the victim was Monique Loon, and she had been found just like this by her neighbor earlier that morning. Based on the progression of rigor mortis, the medical examiner had given a preliminary estimate for the time of death, sometime between 8 o'clock and midnight the night before. Captain P crouched down to get a closer look at the body. But even from a distance, she could tell that the victim had suffered absolutely gruesome injuries. There was blood all over Monique's face and clothes. Her torso looked like it had been completely torn apart by what were clearly stab wounds. Just from a quick visual assessment, P guessed the woman had been stabbed at least a dozen times, maybe more. She also noticed something else right away. There were obvious defense wounds all over Monique's hands and forearms. This told her 2 things. First, this was definitely a murder. And second, Monique had put up a very, very serious fight against her attacker. After a few more moments of observing the body, P stood back up. She asked the officer if any of the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the previous night. The officer shook his head and said, "No, not really." The only thing anyone had mentioned was that Monique's 4 dogs had been barking non-stop for most of the night, starting at around 8 o'clock. P nodded, making a mental note of that. Then she walked over to the front door of the house to check for signs of forced entry. The door was closed. She examined the frame and the lock, but saw nothing. No splintered wood, no pry marks. But as she scanned the area, she did see a faint, bloody handprint on the exterior wall, right next to the door. P carefully turned the handle, which was unlocked, and opened the door. The sight that greeted her was chilling. The hallway just inside the entrance was a horrific scene, absolutely covered in blood. There were splatters on the walls, pools on the floor. It was clear that a violent struggle had taken place right there. P stepped inside, being extremely careful not to contaminate the scene, her eyes scanning every detail. She walked slowly down the hallway, peering into the other rooms. She noticed that the vast majority of the blood was contained to the entryway. This reinforced her initial theory. The attack on Monique had likely started and ended right here, in this hallway. Her working theory began to form. Someone had knocked on the door. Monique had opened it, and her attacker had launched their assault immediately. But then, as P stepped back outside and looked down at the front walkway again, she noticed something that just didn't add up. Despite the massive amount of blood inside the house right by the door, there was absolutely no blood on the walkway between the door and the spot where Monique's body was found. Not a single drop. Given how much blood Monique had clearly lost inside, P found it highly unlikely that she would have been able to run all the way out into the yard after the attack. So, she started to wonder if perhaps the body had been moved after she died. Monique was a large woman. If her killer had not only been able to overpower her in a fight, but also carry or drag her body that distance, P had to assume that the killer was likely very strong. In her mind, the profile of the suspect was starting to solidify. She was looking for a big, strong man. But what she couldn't figure out was the motive for moving the body. Why would a killer risk being seen dragging a corpse out into the front yard where any neighbor could look out their window and see them? It didn't make sense. Unless, for some bizarre reason, they wanted Monique's body to be found as quickly as possible. And since it seemed that Monique had willingly opened the door for her killer, P was almost certain that it had to be someone she knew. Around noon on that same day, Saturday, February 8th, Captain P was about to head next door to speak with Monique's neighbor herself when a car suddenly pulled up to the curb. 3 men got out. They looked utterly shocked and deeply concerned as they stared at the police cars and the crime scene tape surrounding the house. By now, P had learned from the neighbors that Monique had a husband and several adult sons. She immediately assumed that these must be them, returning from their trip. So she quickly walked down the walkway to intercept them, to keep them from walking into the active crime scene. The 3 men, who were indeed Monique's husband Claude and her sons Frank and Pascal, rushed towards her. They crowded around her, their voices filled with panic, asking what was going on, where was Monique, what had happened. P had to deliver the terrible news. She told them, as gently as she could, that Monique had been stabbed to death. For a moment, all 3 of them just stood there in complete silence, the words hanging in the air. Then, one of the sons broke down and just started to cry. P explained that they couldn't go inside the house because it was still being processed for evidence. Instead, she led them over to the curb, away from the scene, and they all sat down. She could see the men were in a state of profound shock. Even though one son was crying, it was like the other 2 couldn't even process the reality of what she had just told them. But as difficult as it was, she needed to ask them questions while the details were still fresh. She pulled out a notepad and gently asked them about the last time they had seen Monique. Claude told her that they had all left the house around 3 o'clock the previous afternoon, leaving Monique at home by herself. He explained they had gone to the family gathering near Paris, stayed the night, and had only just gotten back into town moments ago. They had seen the police presence and had no idea what was going on. P then asked Claude to give her the names of everyone in their family, all the adult children from both sides, Claude's ex-wife, Monique's ex-husband, everybody. As Claude listed the names, he made a point to tell her that he just couldn't imagine anyone in their family being capable of something like this. P nodded understandingly, but she knew from experience that family members were often the first people to look at. She didn't say that, of course. Instead, she just asked, "Can you think of anyone at all who would want to hurt Monique?" Claude thought for a long moment and then shook his head. He said no, she lived a pretty normal, uneventful life. But then, one of the sons spoke up. He said that actually, there might be someone. He said, her neighbor, Henri, and he pointed across the street to the house directly opposite Monique's. A minute later, Captain P was knocking on Henri's front door. After a few seconds, a middle-aged man opened it. He looked out at the commotion across the street with a curious expression. P introduced herself and told him that his neighbor, Monique, had been murdered. And when she said that, Henri smiled. It was a small, subtle smile, but it was unmistakable. Immediately, alarm bells started ringing in Captain P's head. This man was acting incredibly suspicious. She asked him if she could come in and look around. Henri didn't seem surprised by the request at all, almost as if he was expecting to be a suspect. He just said, "Sure, come on in," and stepped aside. P entered the house and began a thorough search of every room. She went through the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. But despite looking everywhere, she found no traces of blood, no recently cleaned areas, nothing at all that seemed suspicious or out of place. Eventually, she made her way back to the living room where Henri was waiting. She asked him where he was the previous evening. He told her very casually that he and his wife were right here at home. P thought it was a pretty weak alibi, just his wife's word against the world, but she made a mental note to follow up with the wife later to confirm his story. Next, P asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. And Henri said, no, not really. Except, he added, that around 7 o'clock, he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. At this, P's attention sharpened. The family had already told her that Monique had a third adult son, Jean-Luc, who had not gone to the party in Paris. If Henri was telling the truth, it meant that Jean-Luc was very likely the last person to see his mother alive. And that made him a prime suspect. Maybe he was even the killer. The next morning, Captain P led a forensics team up the stairs of a rundown apartment building in a sketchier part of town. She knocked on the door to Jean-Luc's apartment. A moment later, a young man answered. After confirming his identity, 2 officers escorted a confused-looking Jean-Luc away to be questioned down at the station. Meanwhile, P and the forensics team went inside to search the apartment. It didn't take long to find something. As P was walking through the living room, one of the officers called her over. He had his flashlight out and was pointing the beam at a spot on the wall. When P got closer, she could see what he was highlighting. There were several tiny dark red droplets splattered on the paint. P pulled out her own flashlight and started her own search. She scoured the walls and the floor near the staircase, looking for any more signs of blood. And she found a few more red droplets near the doorknob of a closet. She opened the closet door. Inside, leaning against the back wall, was a bicycle. She shined her flashlight all over the bike, on the wheels, the frame, the pedals, and she saw it. The underside of the bike was covered in reddish-brown splatters, as if whoever had ridden it last had cycled right through a puddle of blood. An hour later, Captain P walked into an interrogation room at the police station. Jean-Luc was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his face a mask of fear and confusion. P sat down across from him and got straight to the point. She asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the night of February 7th. Jean-Luc explained that he had just stopped by for a visit after work, something he did often. He said he only stayed for about half an hour before he rode his bike back home. When P asked him if he had gone straight home after leaving his mother's, Jean-Luc said no, he hadn't. He explained that his wife's brother, a man named Christophe Gracier, lived in the same apartment building, on the floor right below them. He said that before going up to his own apartment, he stopped by Christophe's place for a few minutes to chat. After that, he claimed he spent the rest of the night in his own apartment with his wife. To Captain P, it felt like he was leaving something out. They had found what looked like blood in his apartment and all over his bike. She felt that if she just pushed him a little harder, his story might start to unravel. So she told him, point blank, that they had found blood in his living room and that it was being sent to the lab for analysis. When Jean-Luc heard this, his face went bright red. He started stammering, trying to explain it away. He said the blood was probably from a neighbor who had cut himself while visiting a few days earlier. P just nodded, her expression unreadable. Then she told him about the blood they'd found all over his bike. At this, Jean-Luc hesitated. He stuttered and stammered, but couldn't come up with any plausible explanation for that. At this point, P felt like she had him cornered. She told him to be quiet for a moment and to roll up his sleeves so she could see his arms. P knew that based on the extensive defensive wounds on Monique's body, her attacker must have some marks on them. She was sure Monique had fought back hard and had likely left at least a few scrapes or bruises on her killer. But when Jean-Luc slowly rolled up his sleeves, P saw nothing. Not a single scratch, not a single bruise on his hands or his arms. It was clean. A few minutes later, P left the interrogation room and walked back to her office. Despite the lack of defensive wounds on his arms, Jean-Luc's behavior was extremely suspicious, and she wasn't ready to let him go just yet. But she also knew she couldn't afford to get tunnel vision. She had to consider other possibilities, just in case the blood in his apartment turned out to be a dead end. She sat down at her desk, opened the case file, and began flipping through the notes from interviews her team had already conducted with the rest of Monique's family and neighbors. Monique's other sons had mentioned the tension between their mother and her 5 stepdaughters. But officers had already spoken to all of the stepdaughters and their husbands, and while some of the women admitted they still had issues with Monique, every single one of them, and their husbands, had solid alibis for the night of the murder. Several family members had also brought up Claude's ex-wife, Beatrice, mentioning that she and Monique definitely did not get along. But officers had tracked down Beatrice, and she just didn't seem like a viable suspect. Beatrice had told them that for the most part, she and Monique just stayed out of each other's way. She said they hadn't even seen each other in over a month. And physically, she seemed an impossible fit for the crime. Beatrice was remarkably tiny and frail. She was 58 years old, barely 4'9", and looked incredibly weak. It seemed almost impossible that she could have overpowered the much larger and stronger Monique, inflicted those horrific injuries, and then dragged her body out to the front yard. It just didn't seem physically possible. So, while she wasn't officially ruled out, she was very low on the list of suspects. Just then, there was a knock on Captain P's office door. She looked up and saw another officer standing there. He told her there were 2 people in the station who wanted to speak with her about the case. P nodded, and a moment later, a nervous-looking middle-aged man and woman walked into her office. They sat down across the desk from her, and the man said they had information that might help with the Monique Lunet investigation. P sat up straight, grabbed a notepad, and said, "Okay, tell me what you have." She began writing as the man explained that he was a co-worker of Christophe Gracier. P immediately recognized the name. That was Jean-Luc's brother-in-law, the person Jean-Luc claimed he had visited on the night of the murder, right after leaving Monique's house. The man sitting across from her said that just a few hours ago, he'd gotten a phone call from Christophe's number. But when he answered it, all he could hear was a muffled conversation between 2 women in the background. At first, the man thought it was just a pocket dial, maybe Christophe's kid playing with the phone. But he said that when he put his phone on speaker, he and his wife, the woman sitting next to him, both started listening very closely. And they were able to make out bits and pieces of the conversation. The 2 women on the line were clearly talking about needing an alibi, and they said something about a man named Jean-Luc. The couple said they heard one of the women say something like, "It's not Jean-Luc's fault, he's depressed." And then they mentioned something about a pair of pants that needed to be washed. Captain P could hardly believe what she was hearing. Any lingering doubts she might have had about Jean-Luc being the killer pretty much vanished in that moment. This sounded like a cover-up. She took down the couple's names and contact information, showed them out of her office, and as soon as they were gone, she grabbed her keys. She was heading straight for Christophe's apartment. By this point, Christoph had already been brought in for questioning, and he had completely denied knowing anything about Monique's murder or the strange phone call that was supposedly made from his number. But P hoped that a search of his apartment might tell a different story. She walked through each room of the apartment until she found the laundry area. She put on a pair of latex gloves, opened the washing machine, and reached inside. She pulled out a pair of men's pants. They were still damp, as if they had just been washed that day. She held the pants up to the light and saw a distinct brownish stain on one of the legs. She also noticed that the pants looked like they would be way too small for Christoph, who was a tall, burly man. But they looked like they would be a perfect fit for a smaller guy, a guy like Jean-Luc. Later that same day, which was now Monday, February 10th, just 2 days after Monique's body was found, Captain P was back in her office when her phone rang. She answered it. It was a technician from the crime lab. He told her they already had the preliminary results from the samples that had been sent in for testing. P braced herself, ready for the news that would hopefully seal the case against Jean-Luc. But what the technician told her was the exact opposite of what she expected. He said that the stains on the bicycle were indeed blood, but it was animal blood. He went on to say that the other little droplets of blood found in Jean-Luc's apartment, the ones on the walls and near the closet door, were human blood, but they were not a match for Monique. And then, the final blow. Those pants they had found in the washing machine? The brownish stain wasn't blood at all. It was just grease. Captain P was incredibly frustrated. In her mind, she had been so sure about Jean-Luc. It really seemed like he was their guy. But now, all the physical evidence against him had evaporated into thin air. As for that bizarre phone call to Christoph's coworker, they had no way of knowing who the two women in the background were, or if the coworker and his wife had even heard the conversation correctly. Maybe they had misheard the part about the alibi and Jean-Luc being depressed. P thanked the lab technician for the update, as disappointing as it was, and was about to hang up. But then he told her to wait, that he had one more piece of news for her. He told her that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had found something significant. There was DNA under Monique's fingernails. It was very likely skin cells from her killer that had been scratched off during the struggle. The technician said it would take at least a few more weeks to get a full analysis. But once the results came back, they could definitely test it against DNA samples from any of their suspects. And maybe, just maybe, they would get a match. This gave P a renewed sense of hope. After she hung up the phone, she started making a list of everyone they would need to get a DNA sample from. At the top of the list were Jean-Luc and Christoph. And then there was the neighbor, Henri. He still seemed like a strong suspect to her. P had spoken to Henri's wife, who had confirmed his alibi, claiming they were together the whole night Monique was killed. But she knew that spouses often lied for each other, so she didn't put much stock in it. So, at this point, P felt she had 3 decent potential suspects to get DNA from. But that was it. The rest of Monique's family had been ruled out. None of the other neighbors seemed suspicious. And by all accounts, Monique lived a quiet suburban life and didn't really have any other enemies. P had a nagging feeling that something was missing, that there was a piece of the puzzle she just wasn't seeing. She decided that in the time she had while waiting for the DNA results, she was going to find it. Over the next few weeks, that's exactly what Captain P did. She pored over all the evidence they had collected, reading every report, looking at every photo. She re-interviewed all the family members and spoke to all the neighbors again. But despite this huge effort, nothing new came up. No new suspects emerged. Then, in early March, about 4 weeks after that first call, P got another call from the crime lab. The technician on the line told her that the DNA analysis had come back. And he said that even before they tested it against any of their specific suspects, the results were already enough to narrow down the field significantly. And when Captain P heard what the technician had to say, she realized that this was it. This was the missing piece of information she had been searching for all along. Based on this revelatory DNA evidence and an eventual confession from the killer, this is what police believe happened to Monique Lunet on the night of the 7th of February, 2003. The killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened, and Monique was standing there. But instead of inviting her visitor inside, Monique just stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression cold. The killer began to speak, attempting to have a conversation. But what was supposed to be a civil discussion quickly escalated into a heated argument. Both of them started hurling insults back and forth. At some point, Monique had enough. She slammed the door right in the killer's face. But just before she did, she said one last thing, something so inflammatory that it pushed the killer completely over the edge. Without even stopping to think about what they were doing, the killer, furious and rejected, stormed over to their vehicle, which was parked nearby. They reached under the driver's seat and grabbed a knife they kept there for self-defense. They marched right back to the front door, the knife clutched in their hand, and knocked again. As soon as Monique opened the door a second time, the killer pushed their way inside. And with a surge of uncontrollable rage, they just started stabbing her. But Monique was a strong woman, and she fought back with everything she had. She managed to knock the killer to the ground and actually pin them there. The killer, however, managed to wrestle the arm holding the knife free and continued the attack. It was an epic, violent struggle. And the whole time this was happening, Monique's 4 dogs were just on the other side of the baby gate at the base of the stairs, barking madly at the chaos unfolding in the entryway. Monique was screaming, a mixture of rage and panic and pain. Finally, the killer was able to break free from Monique's grip. They scrambled to their feet, turned, and bolted out of the house. The killer ran across the yard, jumped in their vehicle, and started to drive away. But as they pulled away from the curb, they looked back and saw Monique stumble out of the front door. She took a few unsteady steps down the walkway, and then she collapsed to the ground. But the killer didn't wait around to see if she was dead. They just sped away. They drove to a nearby supermarket parking lot and threw the murder weapon, the knife, into a public trash can. Then, the killer went home and burned their blood-stained clothes in their stove, believing that would be enough to destroy any evidence linking them to this horrific crime. They thought they were safe, especially since they knew they were the last person anyone would ever suspect of such a violent murder. It would turn out the killer was the 4-foot 9-inch tall, tiny, frail Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 8-year-old ex-wife. In her confession to police, she claimed she had gone to Monique's house that night to finally try and bury the hatchet after all the years of feuding between the two sides of the family. But she said the bad blood just ran too deep. And when Monique apparently insulted Beatrice's daughters, that was the final inflammatory line she'd shouted before slamming the door. Beatrice said she just snapped. Beatrice had been ruled out as a suspect early on, primarily because of her small size. It seemed impossible that she could have committed such a brutal act. The police theory had been that the body was moved, which would have required a lot of strength. But it turned out Monique's body wasn't moved at all. She had stumbled out there herself. She was apparently so full of adrenaline after the attack that she had managed to chase Beatrice out of the house before she finally collapsed and died. And she did that after being stabbed over 50 times and losing a massive amount of blood. Because Monique had fought back so fiercely, she had managed to get traces of Beatrice's DNA under her fingernails. And so, the DNA analysis came back and immediately showed that the killer was a woman. Further testing eventually confirmed that it was a match for Beatrice. As for the strange phone call, investigators never figured out for sure who made it. But their best guess was that the women heard in the background were Christophe's mother and sister, and it was just an innocent conversation about Monique's murder that the coworker had simply misunderstood and misinterpreted. Beatrice Matisse was arrested on the 29th of March 2003. She confessed to the murder immediately, though she later tried to take back her confession. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. It was a tragic end to years of simmering family hatred, a conflict that finally boiled over in a moment of unimaginable violence, all because of a quiet woman who nobody ever thought was capable of it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of the 18th of November 2019, a 54-year-old detective named Musi McKay stood in a long, slow-moving line. He was waiting to get into a courthouse in the city of Ikapa, South Africa. Musi was an investigator, a good one, and today he was on court duty for a very violent robbery case that was, at long last, finally going to trial. The robbery itself had happened nearly 6 years earlier, a lifetime ago in police work. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse just outside of the city. It was a brutal, terrifying home invasion. The men beat the couple severely before they ransacked the home, making off with everything they could carry: electronics, jewelry, a collection of firearms, and other valuables. It was Musi and his team who had worked the case tirelessly. They eventually identified, tracked down, and arrested the criminals responsible. And in a stroke of good police work, they were even able to recover some of the stolen items. Now, as he stood in that line, Musi was holding one of those recovered items. It was a piece of evidence he was scheduled to present in court today. He had done this kind of thing countless times over his long career. Stand in court, present the facts, show the evidence. It was part of the job. But today, he felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was different. It wasn't just the trial prep. He was juggling other active cases, mentoring junior detectives who looked up to him, and he was feeling every one of his 54 years. Musi wasn't the young, energetic officer he used to be. He was getting close to retirement age, and the weight of all his obligations was starting to press down on him. The biggest source of his fatigue, though, was this robbery case itself. It had been an excruciatingly long and complicated process. There were an unusual number of delays, legal challenges, and procedural hurdles that had dragged it out for 6 long years. It had taken so long to bring this case to trial that the very piece of evidence Musi was now holding had actually been returned to the victim couple. The system figured they might as well get to use their property again until the court finally got its act together. Getting the case to this point had been a marathon, not a sprint, and it had drained him. But Musi and his team were absolutely determined to see it through. The men they had arrested weren't petty thieves. They were incredibly violent. They needed to be behind bars, for the good of the public. They had beaten the couple so badly that both of them had ended up in the hospital with serious injuries. It was a miracle they hadn't been killed during the home invasion. Justice, however delayed, was essential. As Musi finally reached the front of the line and entered the courthouse, he passed through the security checkpoint. He gave the guards a nod, hoping they were on high alert today. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones on trial, often had equally violent friends, especially in this region where this kind of crime was unfortunately common. It wasn't unheard of for associates or gang members to try and disrupt court proceedings, sometimes even retaliating against police officers or the prosecution right there in the courthouse. But the security check was smooth. There were no suspicious people loitering, no signs of any trouble. Musi felt a small measure of relief as he made his way down the corridor and into the designated courtroom. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and saw that the room was already full. The defense team was there, the jury was seated, and the public gallery was packed with observers. He walked towards the front of the court. Musi went over and took a seat at the prosecution table. He would stay there until it was his turn to approach the judge and present the state's case, which would include him formally introducing this piece of evidence. As he got settled into his chair, he placed the evidence carefully in his lap. He turned and gave a quick, subtle wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting next to him at the table. She was deeply focused, reviewing her notes one last time. Musi had worked with Adelaide on several cases before. They had a good working relationship, built on mutual respect. In his mind, she was a total professional, sharp, and dedicated. He knew that with her leading the prosecution, their chances of getting a conviction were very strong. Adelaide looked up, saw his wave, and returned it with a brief, confident smile before her eyes went back to the papers in front of her. Musi took another slow look around the courtroom. Everything seemed quiet, orderly. There was no sign of any gang members or friends of the accused trying to intimidate anyone. The air was still and tense with anticipation, as it always was before a major trial began. Musi just hoped it would stay that way. He hoped the trial would go smoothly and end with the verdict he and the victims had waited 6 long years for. A few minutes later, the judge entered, called the court to order, and the trial officially began. Adelaide stood up, straightened her robes, and began to present the case for the prosecution. At that very moment, despite waiting all these years to finally get here, Musi didn't feel a surge of adrenaline or excitement. Instead, a profound wave of exhaustion washed over him. It was almost like relief, the feeling that the final chapter was beginning and his long involvement was almost over. The courtroom was also quite warm, stuffy from all the bodies packed inside. The combination of the heat and his deep fatigue was potent. Before long, his eyelids started to feel heavy, like tiny weights were attached to them. He fought to keep them open, to focus on Adelaide's opening statement, but her voice began to sound distant, muffled. His head felt like it was filling with cotton. Eventually, his head slumped over to the side, his chin resting on his chest. And right there, in the middle of the trial he had worked so hard for, Musi MK dozed off. At first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, he slept, and nobody seemed to notice or care. The trial continued on around him. But then, a sudden, loud scraping sound ripped through the quiet of the courtroom. It was the sound of dozens of wooden chair legs being dragged across the floor all at once. The jarring noise woke Musi up abruptly. He was startled, his heart pounding in his chest. As he jolted awake, disoriented and confused, the evidence he had been holding in his lap slipped from his grabber. It clattered onto the floor beneath the table. He blinked, trying to get his bearings. He was embarrassed. Had anyone seen him sleeping? What was that noise? He saw that people were getting up, moving around. He looked down and saw the evidence on the floor. His first instinct was to get it back before anyone noticed his blunder. He ducked under the table, scooped the item back up, and as he was sitting back up in his chair, he heard a deafening bang echo through the courtroom. It was sharp, explosive, and utterly out of place. He still had no idea what was going on. The room had erupted into chaos. And then he heard a scream coming from his right. He turned his head and realized the scream had come from the prosecutor, Adelaide. Musi looked over the table and saw her on the ground. She was clutching her hip, and a dark stain was rapidly spreading across her clothing. Her hip was gushing blood. She had been attacked. That loud bang he had heard, it was almost certainly a gunshot. Musi's mind instantly jumped to his earlier fear. The criminal's friends must have stormed the courthouse. They had gotten a weapon inside, and they had attacked them. They had shot Adelaide. His training kicked in. Were there more shooters? Were there other attackers in the building? Musi, who had only been awake for about 30 seconds, was still trying to process the frantic scene. He began scanning the courtroom, looking for a perpetrator, a gunman, anyone who looked like they were part of an attack. But he saw nothing of the sort. All he saw was the chaos of terrified people trying to flee the room and a few brave individuals rushing towards Adelaide to try and help her, to render aid. There were no attackers. There were no gunmen. There was just panic and confusion. For a moment, Musi just sat there, almost paralyzed by the shock of it all. He was still shaking off the fog of sleep, trying to make sense of the scene in front of him. He looked around the chaotic courthouse again, his eyes darting from face to face. No gunman, no perpetrator, nothing. And as that fact settled in his mind, it could only mean one thing. A cold, horrifying realization began to creep into his mind as he looked down at the object he now held in his hands. To understand what really happened inside that courtroom, you first have to understand a specific detail about South African police procedure. Normally, as in most countries, after evidence is collected from a crime scene, it's carefully examined, catalogued, and made safe. Then, it's transferred to a secure exhibit room where it stays under lock and key until it's time for trial. This ensures the integrity of the evidence and the safety of everyone in the court. However, in South Africa, there can be exceptions to this strict procedure, especially in cases with extreme delays. And this trial, as we know, had taken almost 6 years just to get started. Because of that immense time lag, some of the evidence recovered from the robbers' hideout has been returned to the original victims. The shotgun that was stolen from their farmhouse was one of those items. The idea was that they should be allowed to have their property back while the justice system took its sweet time. When the trial was finally scheduled, the couple had returned that particular piece of evidence to the police that very morning. Detective Musi McKay had been the one charged with bringing it to court. He was responsible for holding on to it. But in the rush of preparing for the long-awaited day, a critical step was missed. Musi, or someone on his team, had failed to double-check the evidence, to re-examine it, and make sure it was safe to be brought into a crowded courtroom. Sometime after Musi had fallen asleep, the judge had announced a short recess. The loud scraping of chairs that had startled him awake was simply the sound of everyone getting up to take a break. But for Musi, deep in sleep, the sudden noise was like an explosion. He had sat up suddenly, confused, and in that disoriented moment, he dropped the evidence onto the floor. And it turned out that was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Because that particular piece of evidence was the shotgun recovered from the robbers. When Musi, in his panicked, instinctive state, saw the shotgun on the ground, he had one thought: get it back before the judge or prosecutor saw that he'd fallen asleep and dropped it. He reached down quickly to scoop it up. But the shotgun, because it had never been re-examined after being returned by the victims, was still loaded. And as Musi hastily grabbed it from under the table, his finger accidentally hit the trigger. The gun fired. The blast hit Adelaide Ferreira-Watt in the hip, severing a major artery. The wound was catastrophic, and it would prove to be fatal. Musi was so confused by the chaos and the suddenness of it all that at first he didn't even realize he had been the one to fire the gun. He just scooped it up, heard the bang, and immediately thought they were under attack. It was only when he scanned the room and found no gunman, no other explanation, that he looked down at the shotgun in his own hands. And he realized it was aimed in the direction of where Adelaide had been standing. He must have been the one who shot her. In the end, Musi MK pleaded guilty to culpable homicide and negligence. For his role in the tragic death of his colleague, he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, that sentence was fully suspended. On the morning of the 14th of July, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden. He was carefully getting dressed, preparing himself for the most important day of his life. Francisco was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympic Games. A marathon is a grueling long-distance race covering exactly 26.2 miles. For the world's most elite runners, it typically takes between 2 and 3 hours to complete. Francisco was representing his home country of Portugal. And this was a very big deal for everyone back home. It was Portugal's very first time participating in the Olympics, which meant Francisco was one of only a handful of Portuguese athletes at the Games. And out of all of them, Francisco genuinely believed he stood the best chance of bringing home a medal. He had a chance to do something truly historic, to put his country on the sporting map. Realistically, he wasn't even that nervous. He knew he was an incredible runner, one of the best in the world. Even though he was only 21, Francisco had already won 3 major marathons in Portugal. He was a star back home, a national hero in the making. But he also knew that winning on the world stage at the Olympics would require him to be more prepared than he had ever been in his life. So that's exactly what he had done. He had trained for months, pushing his body to its absolute limit. He had recently undergone a full medical examination to confirm he was in peak physical health. And he had even spent weeks thinking about the little details, the small ways he could give himself an edge over the competition. He thought about what to eat, what to drink, what to put in his body, and even what to put on his body. He knew that even the smallest thing, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that sat too heavily in his stomach, could be the difference between winning a gold medal and finishing in last place. The margins at this level were razor thin. Any little edge he could find, he was going to take it. So now, on the morning of the race, Francisco spent the next hour meticulously putting on the specific clothes he had selected and eating a perfectly balanced, light meal of carbohydrates and protein. It was all part of the plan he had mapped out. He had also been warned by race officials that it was supposed to be extremely hot on race day. But Francisco actually saw this as an advantage. He was from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than in a place like Sweden. He was used to the heat. He felt he knew how to protect himself from the sun and how to use the sweltering weather to his advantage against runners from cooler climates. Before he knew it, Francisco was ready. He left his hotel room and made his way to the stadium to compete in the Olympic marathon. A few hours later, around 1:45 in the afternoon, Francisco walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive sun-drenched stadium where the race was set to begin. As race officials directed him and the 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Francisco was feeling incredibly confident. So confident, in fact, that he called out to a nearby reporter who was covering the event. He told the reporter, with a grin, that he was going to be the winner, famously declaring, "I win or I die." As Francisco and the other runners took their spots on the starting line, they were standing in the direct sunlight, and it was unbelievably hot. In the shade, at the edge of the stadium, the temperature was already 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a sweltering, oppressive day. As Francisco looked up and down the line of his competitors, he saw that many of them already looked flushed. Their faces were red, and they were sweating profusely. They didn't look ready to run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed before the race had even begun. But Francisco wasn't overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, he wasn't even sweating. As he stood there, waiting for the race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people who had packed the stands. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in, appreciating how special this moment was. The marathon was a major event at these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out. Even the King and Queen of Sweden were rumored to be somewhere in the crowd, watching. And as Francisco stood there, soaking in the atmosphere, he felt a deep certainty that when this race was over, all those people in the stadium and people all around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer's voice boom over the loudspeaker, telling the runners to take their marks. Francisco felt a surge of adrenaline. A hush fell over the crowd. He and the rest of the racers stopped moving, tensing their bodies, waiting for the signal. A few seconds passed in complete silence, and then, bang, the starting gun went off. Francisco and everyone else lunged forward. There was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line together, and Francisco found himself pushed back towards the middle of the pack. Right off the bat, he was a little surprised by how quick the pace was. But he still wasn't worried. He had studied the course maps extensively, and he knew he would have his chance to get out in front later on. This particular marathon route was very flat, but Francisco was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous and hilly terrain. So he was sure that once the other runners inevitably started to get tired, especially from the blistering heat, he would still be feeling fine. He could make his move then. So Francisco decided to hang back, conserve his energy, and wait for the right moment as the pack of runners moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt roads beyond. For the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan. He kept his pace steady, running comfortably in the middle of the group. He knew that at some point, runners would start falling off as the heat and the distance wore them down. He would be able to make his way up through the field then. He wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident. In fact, as he was keeping his pace, he was even able to give another quick soundbite to a reporter who was covering the race from the side of the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Francisco Lazaro felt like he was running the race of his life. It was as if everything in his training, his preparation, and his background had led him to this moment, to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently and easily moving past other runners. Some of them were really struggling in the heat, clearly not used to it. He saw some who had stopped running altogether, bent over with their hands on their knees, gasping for air. Others were just sitting on the side of the road, unable to get up. Basically, everything was playing out exactly the way Francisco had expected it to. He was slowly but surely making his move towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for him, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. All of a sudden, he just felt really off. His legs suddenly felt incredibly heavy, like they were made of lead. A few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry at the edges. Francisco kept running, telling himself he was fine, that this was just late race fatigue kicking in. And to be fair, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that the real halfway point of the race isn't at 13 miles, but at around the 19 or 20 mile mark. That's the point where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. So he tried to rationalize it, telling himself that this was normal, that this happens when you hit mile 20. As Francisco worked as hard as he could to just put one foot in front of the other to keep going, he began telling himself that this pain was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name. He was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to completely giving out from under him. He slammed hard onto the hot, dusty ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled a man in on a stretcher. They quickly explained that the man's name was Francisco Lazaro and that he had collapsed in the middle of the marathon. The doctor wasn't particularly surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who had gotten sick from the oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began to examine Francisco specifically, he knew that this case was different. It was much, much more serious. The other patients he had seen that day all had relatively mild symptoms, things like excessive sweating, general fatigue, and dizziness. They had all been easily treated by giving them water and cooling them off. But Francisco was twitching and convulsing uncontrollably. He was shouting deliriously, claiming that he had won the race. The doctor rushed him into an exam room and immediately took his temperature. When he saw the reading, he knew the situation was critical. It was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit. A body temperature that high was often fatal. Francisco's organs were likely already shutting down. The doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in water and ice, anything to cool him down. But Francisco did not respond to any of the hospital's treatments. As the hours passed by, his condition actually got worse. The doctor and his team worked tirelessly through the night, treating Francisco and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Francisco Lazaro died. After his death, that doctor just could not shake the feeling that something was off about what had happened. Yes, heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Francisco had presented with a very severe case of it. But lots of other runners had gotten heat stroke during that same marathon, and all of them had recovered and were ultimately fine. So the doctor decided to run some tests on Francisco's body to see if maybe there was something else going on, perhaps an underlying illness or some other factor that was to blame for his tragic death. And when the doctor finally got those test results back, the answer made Francisco Lazaro famous all over the world. Remember, Francisco had put an incredible amount of thought into how to prepare for his big race. He trained hard, he ate right, he chose the perfect clothes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a major factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken had paid off. When he looked down the starting line and saw all the other runners pouring with sweat, their faces flushed, it seemed like they were already exhausted. But not Francisco. He wasn't even sweating. But not sweating in that kind of extreme heat was actually a very, very bad thing. Sweat is the body's natural and essential way of cooling itself down. When sweat evaporates from the skin, it takes heat with it. So Francisco's lack of sweat was actually a giant red flag, a sign that his body was in serious danger. And it was all thanks to what he thought was his secret weapon against the sun. It would turn out that Francisco, so determined to be prepared, had gone out and found what he believed would be the best and most powerful sunscreen imaginable. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of hard animal fat that's typically used in cooking or for making things like candles and soap. It's also sometimes used in skincare products because it's rich in nutrients. Francisco believed that because suet is so thick and waxy, it would act as a powerful barrier, protecting his skin from the intensity of the sun. So, just before the race, he had slathered a thick layer of suet all over his body. What he didn't anticipate was that this layer of fat would work far too well. It was so thick and non-porous that it clogged every pore in his skin. It created an impermeable seal, preventing anything from passing through, including his own sweat. And without any way to cool itself down, Francisco's body essentially turned into a furnace. As he ran for miles in the scorching heat, his internal temperature just kept climbing higher and higher, effectively cooking him from the inside out. The weekend after Francisco Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him. Over 20,000 people attended to pay their respects. It probably wasn't the kind of fame he had dreamed of when he stood on that starting line, but Francisco's name is still frequently referenced in Portugal today. When someone looks sick, pale, and bedraggled, the Portuguese sometimes say that they look like Lazaro. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick was sitting on the floor of a vacant studio apartment. He was in a somewhat run-down apartment building where he both lived and worked, located in a coastal town in northern England called Satan Carew. The building itself was called The Cliff, and it was perched right across the street from the ocean, offering a wide, gray view of the water. Carl was in the middle of a job, painting the apartment to get it ready for a new tenant, but he'd taken a break. He had his lunch spread out on a dust sheet beside him and was deep into one of his favorite spy novels. Carl was a huge fan of spy stories. He had a small collection of books that he would just read over and over again, finding something new in them each time. But as he was about to turn a page, a movement outside the window pulled his attention away from the book. He looked out and saw his landlady, a woman named Anne Darwin. She lived in a large Victorian house right next door to the apartment building. At that moment, she was standing in front of her house, but she wasn't alone. She was with her two adult sons, Anthony and Mark. What struck Carl immediately was that all three of them were dressed entirely in black. And each one was holding a wreath made of flowers. Feeling a bit like one of the spies from his novels, Carl stayed low and watched from the window. He saw the family of three walk across the street together, moving towards a grassy knoll that overlooked the sea. From his vantage point, he watched as Anne and her sons stood there for a moment, then bowed their heads. He could tell they were likely praying or sharing a moment of quiet remembrance. Then, one by one, all three of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean, watching as the waves carried them away. Carl knew exactly what this was about. They were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin. 2 years earlier, John had died in a tragic kayaking accident right there in the waters just in front of their house. As Carl watched, he could see Anne's shoulders shaking. It was clear she was crying, and seeing her grief made him feel a pang of sadness himself. Carl cared deeply for Anne. Their relationship was complicated. He wasn't just her handyman and tenant, they had been secretly and romantically involved for almost 2 years, ever since he had first moved into the cliff. But Carl's connection to Anne went back much further than that. He had known her for most of his life, and, if he was being honest with himself, he had been in love with her for decades. Both Carl and Anne had grown up in a town near Satan, Carew. The very first time Carl ever saw her was on the school bus back in high school. He had been completely captivated by her but was too shy to ever work up the courage to say hello. Soon after, he left for college, but the memory of her never really faded. After finishing his education, Carl went on to build a life of his own. He became a school teacher and started a family. But his life took a sharp downturn after he made a series of really bad real estate investments. His financial troubles spiraled into legal troubles, and eventually, it all fell apart. He ended up leaving his family and going on the run from the police. He found himself living in the woods just outside of Satan, Carew, a shadow of the man he once was. And that's when fate, or something like it, brought him and Anne back into each other's lives. One evening, he was near his campsite when he saw a car pull into a nearby parking lot. He recognized Anne at the wheel, and she looked incredibly upset. This time, all these years later, he decided to approach her. He walked over to her car and gently knocked on the window. It turned out that her husband's kayaking accident had happened only a few weeks before. She was emotionally shattered and completely overwhelmed. On top of her grief, she was also desperate for help managing the properties she and her husband had owned together. That very same night, she offered him a place to stay. She let him move into one of the empty apartments at the cliff. And once Carl was settled in, their relationship slowly blossomed into a quiet, unconventional romance. His days were spent working, fixing up the apartments in the building. His nights were spent with Anne in her house next door. Keeping their relationship a secret was strange for both of them, but they each had their reasons. Carl was terrified of being arrested. He was still a wanted man, so if anyone knew his true identity or where he was, it would all be over. For Anne, the situation was different. She felt that her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow, possibly for the rest of her life. She was worried about what people would think if it looked like she had moved on so quickly after her husband's death. Their shared dream was that at some point, Anne could sell her properties. They would take the money, move far away together, and start a completely new life. But they both knew it was a long shot. The biggest hurdle was Carl. He would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without a valid passport and without getting arrested. Back in the apartment, Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street and into their house. He sighed, picked up his spy novel, and went back to reading. But he wasn't just reading for pleasure anymore. As he followed the story's plot and the actions of the main character, he was making mental notes. He was actively searching for inspiration, for a clever trick or a loophole he could use. Carl was working on a grand plan, a plan that he hoped would finally allow him and Anne to escape and start their new life together. He was using these spy novels as his textbooks. A small smile crept onto his face as he thought about how brilliant his scheme was. He even imagined that someday in the future, an author might write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 long years for Carl to finalize every detail of his plan. But finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready. He walked through the airport near Satan, Carew, trying his best to look casual and blend in with the other travelers. He approached the ticketing counter, his heart pounding in his chest. He handed his passport to the gate agent, then glanced over his shoulder. He saw Anne standing at the back of the line. Their eyes met for just a second before she quickly looked away. They had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other, just in case something went wrong. When Carl turned back, he saw the ticketing agent staring intently at his passport. His heart rate kicked up another notch. This was the moment of truth. The passport he was using was a fake. He had meticulously created a whole new identity for himself. He had used the birth and death records of a baby who had been born in the same year as him but had died in infancy. It was an idea he'd lifted directly from one of his favorite spy novels, The Day of the Jackal, which was about an assassin who constantly changed identities. If this worked, if this agent bought the fake passport, he and Anne would be on a flight to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was to stay there permanently. He hoped that Anne would fall in love with the place and eventually move there to be with him. He had read a travel brochure on Panama that described it as a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases. That description made him feel like he would fit right in. Plus, the cost of living was incredibly low compared to the UK, and it was thousands of miles away from anyone who might recognize him. It seemed like the perfect place for them to disappear. But everything hinged on this one moment. It all depended on his fake passport being convincing enough to get past this agent. After what felt like an eternity, the agent looked up from the passport, smiled, and handed it back to Carl along with his boarding pass. Carl had to physically restrain himself from letting out a huge sigh of relief. Instead, he just gave a casual thank you to the agent. As he walked away from the counter, he turned back one more time and gave a subtle wink to Anne, who was still waiting in line. After decades of just reading about international spies, Carl felt like he had finally become one. And he had to admit, he liked the feeling a lot. Soon, he would be living full-time as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside Anne in the back of a Jeep. A real estate agent was driving them through the lush Panamanian countryside. They sped along a highway that cut through the jungle, and with every mile, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a sharp bend in the road, and suddenly, the dense jungle gave way to a stunning, sandy beach. The realtor pulled the car over and told them to get out, to take a look around and see if this particular plot of land felt like it could be their new home. Carl had done the math 100 times. Once Anne sold the apartment building and combined that money with the life insurance payout she had received after her husband's death, they would have around £600,000 in savings. That was roughly 800,000 American dollars. It was more than enough to get them set up, but they would need a steady source of income in Panama as well. That's where this land came in. Carl's big idea was to buy this piece of jungle paradise and open an eco-lodge resort. These types of resorts were becoming incredibly popular in Central America. Tourists would pay good money to stay in rustic beachside cabins for a week, go canoeing, horseback riding, and trekking through the jungle. Carl also planned to build a private villa on the property just for him and Anne, right there on the beach. He led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed across the bay to the tree line. He told her to imagine a row of beautiful cabins nestled among the trees. He described a long dock stretching out into the water with a bunch of canoes tied up to it. He talked about a path that would lead from the cabins to a horse stable hidden in the woods. Then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to picture a magnificent seaside villa, their home, where the two of them would live out their days. Anne kicked off her sandals and waded into the warm water. Carl could see it in her eyes. She was picturing it, imagining the life they could have here. For Carl, it felt like years of meticulous, risky planning were finally about to pay off. This trip had been the best week of his entire relationship with Anne. For the first time, they could act like a normal couple. They went out to dinner in public every night. They walked down the street holding hands without fear. Carl loved being John Jones. He felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in a very long time. And oddly enough, even though his identity was a complete fabrication, he felt more like his old self, the person he was before all the debt and the legal problems had crushed him. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne was completely sold on the idea. She told Carl that she was taken with Panama and that yes, she wanted to move here with him. She promised that as soon as she got back to England, she would get her affairs in order and prepare for the big move. Carl was beaming. Their realtor, sensing the happy moment, grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the day they decided to change their lives forever. It took another full year for Anne to sort everything out back home. She had to sell her properties in Satan, Carew, and, even more difficult, she had to tell her family that she was moving to Panama, of all places. They were all shocked at first. It seemed like such a random and drastic decision, but eventually they came to understand. They believed she needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life with John. Shortly after Anne sold the last of the properties, Carl used some of their funds to buy a condominium in Panama City. It would be a place for them to live while they were building their dream resort. And then, finally, on the 22nd of October 2007, Anne moved to Panama for good. That night, Carl picked her up from the airport and drove her to their new home. As he drove, he had to force a smile. He had recently discovered some news, some terrible news, that was going to throw their entire new life into jeopardy. He gave Anne a quick tour of their penthouse apartment, then asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. Anne immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her expression shifted from excitement to worry. Carl took a deep breath. He told Anne how excited he was to build their resort together, but then he dropped the bomb. There was one last, unexpected obstacle standing in their way. He explained that he had only learned about it a few weeks ago and had been waiting for the right moment to tell her in person. He had discovered that the Panamanian government had recently instituted new procedures for anyone moving to the country. All new residents, including English citizens, now needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police. This was to prove they had no criminal record. For Anne, this was no problem at all. But for Carl, it was a catastrophe. He was living in Panama as John Jones. If the authorities looked into his identity, they would very quickly discover that John Jones didn't really exist. Anne put her head in her hands and whispered, "What are we going to do?" Carl admitted that he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised her that he would figure something out. He always did. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne along a busy street in Panama City. They window shopped, but Carl's mind was racing. He was trying to think of any possible way he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in Panama illegally. He was done with hiding. The whole point of coming here was so that he and Anne could finally live their lives together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop where she was looking at furniture for their new apartment. As he wandered aimlessly around the store, he came across a bookshelf filled with old books. He saw a few spy novels among them. All the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't read them, but he picked one up anyway. He began flipping through the pages, just hoping for some kind of spark, some kind of inspiration. And as he stood there, an idea did come to him. But it wasn't inspired by the book in his hands. He suddenly remembered the plot of a different spy novel, one he had read more than a decade ago. At the time he read it, he had thought the central plot was absolutely insane, far too crazy to ever work in real life. But now, as he and Anne walked around the city that afternoon, he kept coming back to that idea. He started to turn it over in his mind, seeing how he might just be able to adapt it to his own situation. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was incredibly risky, maybe the riskiest thing they had ever attempted. But he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, the 2nd of December 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom. He was wandering around the West End of London, doing his best to look utterly lost and confused. He walked through streets decorated with festive Christmas displays, looking around with a vacant expression, until a concerned store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. Carl gave her a shy, hesitant smile and asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" When she told him it was because it was December, he pretended to be baffled, as if he had no idea what month or even what year it was. He claimed he didn't know where he was. He then asked the clerk for help. Just as he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern. She took him by the arm and escorted him to the nearest police station. Inside, she explained to the officer at the front desk that something was seriously wrong with this man. The officer smiled kindly at Carl and asked him what the problem was. Carl knew that what he did next had to be an award-winning acting performance. The success of his entire plan depended on it. He scratched at his head, looked at the officer with pleading eyes, and said that he thought he had lost his whole family. The officer's demeanor immediately became more serious. He sat up straighter and asked for his name. And for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name. Carl had come to a realization. The only way he could ever truly feel like his old self again in Panama was to actually become his old self. He needed to reclaim the identity he had left behind. But to do that without also reclaiming all his old debt and his outstanding legal problems, it was going to require one more colossal lie. Carl looked the police officer in the eye and explained that he knew his name, but that was it. He claimed he couldn't remember anything else about himself because, he said, he had amnesia. The officer just stared at him, obviously dumbfounded. He then turned and called for his supervisor. From that moment on, things started to move very, very fast, but not at all in the direction that Carl had expected. Carl had believed that by claiming amnesia, he could essentially wipe his slate clean in England. He figured he could resume his old life under his real name, make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial position, and then get a real, legitimate passport. With that, he and Anne could live happily and truly openly in Panama. But that is not what happened. Almost immediately, the newspapers caught wind of his incredible story, and it exploded. It made the front page. To the rest of the world, Carl had a story that was almost unbelievable. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, a man with no memory of his past, no knowledge of his own identity. Almost overnight, he became a massive international news sensation. The entire world wanted to know, where had this man been for the past few years? Carl had not anticipated any of this publicity. He and Anne were both horrified. Their horror turned to pure panic when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph they had found on an obscure real estate website in Panama. In the picture, Carl could be seen standing next to Anne and their realtor. All three of them were beaming with happiness after a successful day of viewing properties. This photograph was very, very bad for Carl. It was irrefutable proof that he had not been wandering around the UK homeless with amnesia, just as he had told the police. But the photo was even worse for Anne. It was devastating, because it proved something far more shocking, far more terrible than simple financial fraud. This one picture unraveled a story so outlandish that it sounded like it must have come directly from the pages of a fictional spy novel. It would turn out that Anne was not the grieving widow she had pretended to be for years. And her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick at all. Carl's real name, the one he had given to that police officer in London when he was faking amnesia, was John Darwin. He was Anne Darwin's supposedly dead husband. The two of them had faked his death in that kayaking accident all those years ago. It was an elaborate scheme to escape his crippling debt and so that they could fraudulently claim his life insurance money. Not even their own sons knew their father was still alive. For years, they had grieved for a man who was secretly living right next door. Only Anne and, of course, John were in on the secret. John and Anne were both quickly arrested for fraud. They ended up serving more than 3 years in prison. In a strange way, John's very unhappy ending mirrors the ending of the very book he used for inspiration, The Day of the Jackal. In that novel, the assassin pulls off a series of impressive feats to change his identity and evade capture, but in the end, he still gets caught. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on the 9th of October 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Bologasov sat in the common room of a tiny research station This station was located on a remote, frozen island in Antarctica. The common room served as the general multi-purpose hangout area for the station's crew. Oleg was sitting there watching television while his coworker, a man named Sergey, sat in a chair nearby, quietly reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol and had been for a while. When they weren't on duty, there really wasn't much else to do in that isolated place besides sit around and drink. Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months at this point. He was part of a 14-person crew on a year-round research mission. Their job was to observe the island's ocean and weather patterns, collecting data for their home country of Russia. Oleg's primary responsibility was maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which kept him busy for a good portion of the day. But there was still a significant amount of downtime, and Oleg spent almost all of it inside. Being outside in Antarctica was generally a very bad idea. The landscape was riddled with hundreds of lethal, deep ice crevasses, many of them barely visible under the snow. If you fell into one, you were dead. The fall itself could kill you, or you would simply be trapped and freeze. On top of that, there were the obviously freezing temperatures and the constant threat of violent, lethal blizzards. It was a place that was fundamentally not built for human beings. So, Oleg and his coworkers only ever went outside when their work absolutely required it. Otherwise, they were confined to the station's buildings. And inside, their entertainment options were severely limited. There was a television that only got 2 channels. There was a small gym. There was a nearby church. And there was a library. By this point in his tour, Oleg was sick of all of it. He was even tired of the library, which was a shame because he loved to read. But the library was tiny, and he had already read almost every single book on its shelves. His colleague, Sergey, who was sitting near him, also loved to read. Books were one of the few things the two men actually spent a lot of time talking about. Since Oleg couldn't find anything interesting to watch on the 2-channel TV and was feeling intensely bored and stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergey was in the mood for one of their deep, literary conversations. Oleg turned off the TV, tossed the remote onto a chair, and took a long swig of his drink. He glanced over to the corner where Sergey was absorbed in his book. He saw the cover. It was the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read it. The book is about a depressed man suffering from insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts a secret club where people just literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had one of the most epic plot twists he had ever read. So, Oleg got up and walked over to Sergey. He asked him what he thought of the book so far. But Sergey just grunted and kept reading, effectively ignoring him. Oleg wasn't surprised by this. He knew Sergey very well. The two of them had worked closely together on various research projects over the years. He knew that Sergey was a generally quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved to get into long, passionate discussions about everything and anything. Sometimes, Oleg could coax Sergey out of his shell by asking a lot of questions or telling jokes. But today did not seem to be one of those days. This was frustrating for Oleg, but he could take a hint. He could tell that Sergey just wanted to be left alone to read. So, he stood up and left the common room to go find something else to do. Oleg spent the next few hours just wandering around the station, checking some of the research logs, and continuing to sip his drink. He briefly thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air. But when he checked the outdoor temperature, he saw that it was well below freezing. He decided against it. So, after 3 hours of trying and failing to kill time, Oleg finally gave up and headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3 in the afternoon when Oleg stepped into the dining room. He was feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he had been drinking all day. And the first person he saw when he got inside was Sergey. He was sitting at a table, still reading Fight Club, just as he had been doing hours earlier in the common room. Oleg got himself some food and then went over to sit with Sergey. He figured he'd try again and see if maybe now he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, he was. When Oleg sat down, Sergey actually put his book down on the table and looked up, ready to talk. It was possible that he had also had a lot to drink by this point and was feeling a bit more sociable. So the two men began to discuss the book Fight Club. Very quickly, their conversation became really energetic. They were both a bit drunk and were getting excited about the points they were making. Then, Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic and insightful point about the book and its deeper meaning. To Oleg, it seemed like the conversation was going great. But then, all of a sudden, right after he made his point, Oleg noticed that Sergei had gone completely silent. His face had changed. Oleg, who could read Sergei very well by now, knew what this meant. Sergei was done talking. He wanted some space again. Oleg glanced down at his watch. He realized he actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over. He was about to look up and tell Sergei that he was going to go leave to check on one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergei was gone. He had vanished from the table. And at that exact same moment, a wild, agonized scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building at the station, the research station's manager was in his office, going through some paperwork. Suddenly, his office door flew open with a bang. The manager looked up and saw one of his employees standing in the doorway, looking absolutely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps, like he was in a state of shock. When the employee managed to explain why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the man not to move. He then grabbed his heavy coat and flew out the door, into the brutal, freezing cold. The manager struggled to pull on his coat as he ran across the ice-packed ground, heading for the building that housed the cafeteria. The whole way there, he felt his own panic growing and growing. Because what that employee had just told him was something that had never, ever happened at their research station before. In fact, he wasn't even sure if it had ever happened on the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally reached the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside. What he saw made him feel immediately sick to his stomach. It would turn out that Oleg and Sergei had been coworkers for a very long time. And because they knew each other so well, Oleg had learned over the years what specific things really truly annoyed Sergei. And Oleg, it seems, used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergei was by violating a very serious, unspoken rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Every single time Sergei would start reading a new book, Oleg would wait until he was about halfway through, and then he would spoil the ending for him. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a pattern. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly and deliberately ruined them for Sergei, which always made Sergei incredibly angry. And that day, in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergei, he didn't just make a great point about the book Fight Club. He told Sergei exactly how it ended. He revealed the big, famous twist. And Sergei, who was very drunk and who, like Oleg, had also been feeling very restless and tense from having been cooped up in that isolated station for months on end, finally snapped. This time, when Oleg spoiled the ending, Sergei completely lost control. He went into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, walked up behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest, all while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did you?" Once Sergei had calmed down, he was so shocked and horrified by what he had done that he immediately walked to the manager's office and turned himself in. He was then transported all the way back to Russia and arrested. He was eventually acquitted, however, since he had no previous criminal record. As for Oleg, his heart was severely damaged in the attack, but amazingly, after being evacuated to a hospital, he would survive. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of the 4th of August, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits was rushing around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. She reached past her husband, Barry, who was busy washing the last of the breakfast dishes at the sink, and she grabbed a clean coffee mug from the cupboard. It was a Tuesday morning, and just like any other Tuesday, they were both getting ready for what they knew would be busy days at work. Charlotte was a well-respected school administrator for the local district, and Barry was the acting mayor of their small town, a tight-knit community of about 9,000 people where everyone seemed to know everyone else. As Barry dried his hands and left the sink to go grab his briefcase from the dining room table, Charlotte, who was pouring herself a cup of coffee, reminded him about her schedule. She had a hair appointment later that morning, and she also wanted to let him know she'd probably be home later than usual. The reason was she had a difficult meeting with her attorneys that afternoon. You see, Charlotte was unfortunately in the middle of a tense and complicated legal battle. The battle was with her own cousin, a man named Wayne, and it was all over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. The uncle had been quite successful and had left a lot of valuable land directly to Charlotte. But her cousin Wayne believed that he deserved a piece of that land too. So he was formally contesting the will, and today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their respective lawyers were all scheduled to meet and try to hash things out once and for all. Barry turned to Charlotte and asked if she had decided what she was going to say at this meeting. Had she made up her mind about what to do? Charlotte just shook her head and said no, she was still thinking it over. She knew deep down she didn't want to just give up the land her uncle had specifically left to her. But at the same time, she hated the idea of tearing her family apart over money. It just wasn't worth it to her. Barry walked over to where she was standing, and he put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He told her that whatever happened, no matter what she decided, the family would get through it together. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and then he left for work. Once Barry was out the door, Charlotte finished her coffee and left the kitchen. She walked up the stairs and knocked gently on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. As soon as her knuckles rapped against the wood, Charlotte heard a low groan from inside the room. She opened the door, just a crack, and peered inside. She found Kara curled up in bed, looking very tired and very pale. Charlotte knew this wasn't just a case of a teenager trying to get out of going to school. The reason Kara looked and sounded the way she did was because she was pregnant and she was dealing with some pretty severe morning sickness. Now, to be honest, Charlotte was not at all thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant. But what made it even worse for her was that she absolutely could not stand Kara's boyfriend, a young man named Dave Reed. In Charlotte's eyes, Dave was nothing but trouble. He drank too much, he was constantly getting into minor scrapes with the law, and he was just not the kind of person Charlotte wanted her daughter to be with. At one point, before Kara was pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had actually forbidden her from seeing Dave. They had laid down the law and told her you cannot date him anymore. But in secret, the two teenagers had continued to see each other. And now, Kara was pregnant. So, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a deep sense of disappointment in her daughter's choices. But she also knew, more than ever, that her daughter was going to need a lot of support from her, not just to finish high school, but also to navigate the challenges of being a teen mom. So, for the time being, Charlotte was just trying to keep the peace. With that in mind, she stepped into the bedroom and softly asked Kara how she was feeling. Kara just kind of shrugged from under the covers and said she was okay, just a little nauseous. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded. She walked around the room, tidying up a little bit as she spoke. Then she reminded Kara that her older sister, Heather, was coming home from college that night. She said it would be really nice if they could all have dinner together as a family. Kara told her that she did have a babysitting job that would take up most of the day, but she promised she would be home in time for dinner. Charlotte was pleased to hear that. She told Kara she would see her later that night, said goodbye, and then explained that she had to get going to work herself. So Charlotte left the bedroom, went back downstairs, grabbed her purse from the entryway table, and headed out through the garage to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30, Charlotte's car was driving back down her quiet residential street, heading toward her house. She lived in a respectable, upper-middle-class neighborhood where pretty much all the neighbors knew each other by name. Historically, crime had been very low in the area. Although it was true that recently there had been a string of robberies nearby, which had put some of the residents on edge. But for the most part, Charlotte and her family always felt safe in their home. Charlotte was having a pretty hectic day. She'd had a very busy morning at work, then she'd gone to the salon for her scheduled haircut, and pretty soon she needed to get back to the office for a few more hours before her big afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. The thing was, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked immediately after leaving the salon. She always felt it was a bit too styled. So she wanted to make a quick stop at her house to restyle it herself before heading back to work to finish up her day. She pulled her car into the garage, got out, and ran inside the house. She went straight upstairs to the master bathroom. And just as she was plugging in her blow dryer, she heard a door open downstairs. The sound surprised her. She thought Kara was already off at her babysitting job, and Barry almost never came home for his lunch break. So she set the blow dryer down on the counter and went to go see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 in the afternoon, Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter Heather pulled her car up to the house. She had just arrived from her college, which was located a few towns away, and she was really excited to see her parents and her sister when they all got home from work that night. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something a little odd. She saw that the main garage door was wide open, and her mom's car was parked inside. This surprised her because when she had spoken to her mom on the phone the day before, Charlotte had specifically said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6 o'clock that evening. But Heather didn't think too much of it. She just figured her mom's plans had changed. So she grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of big grocery bags filled with her belongings out of the back seat of her car. Then, as she walked into the garage to make her way into the house, she saw that the interior door, the one that led from the garage into the kitchen, was already open, but just a crack. This was also kind of strange. There was no real reason for that door to be left ajar. And so now, sensing that maybe something was a little bit off, Heather walked up to the door and slowly pushed it open. She called out for her mother, asking what she was doing home so early. But there was no answer. The house was completely silent. Heather stepped into the kitchen and set down her hamper and the bags on the floor. Then she began walking through the first floor of the house, trying to figure out where her mom was. She couldn't hear her, she couldn't see her. She walked from the kitchen, through the dining room, and as she rounded the corner into the main foyer, she saw her. Her mom was lying at the foot of the stairs, completely motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom's side and grabbed her, trying to see if she was okay. But when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold to the touch. In a panic, Heather ran into the living room, snatched the phone from its cradle, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department sped down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and his siren blaring. He was responding to a 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive. He had been very surprised when the dispatcher had told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's acting mayor, Barry Waits. As he pulled up in front of the home, he saw a young woman come running out the front door crying hysterically. Lieutenant Carter stopped his patrol car, got out, and he intercepted the young woman, who immediately begged him to come inside and help her mom. Carter and the young woman rushed over to the house together. He told her to stay outside on the porch while he went in to investigate. And she did. She stayed out front, just quietly weeping to herself, while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door. And right away, just inside the foyer, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a staircase. She was completely still. Nearby, the contents of a woman's purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down beside the woman and felt for a pulse on her neck, but there was nothing. So, Carter stood back up and just took a moment to assess the scene. The first thing he noticed was that there was a bit of foam at the corner of the woman's mouth. This made him wonder if maybe she had suffered a seizure or some sort of severe allergic reaction at the top of the stairs. Maybe she had lost her balance and fallen, and the fall had killed her. But then he also noticed that there were a few distinct drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he saw that there were very obvious scratch marks on her chin and also a dark red mark that went all the way around her neck. And in that moment, he realized this woman had likely not just fallen down the stairs. It looked like she had been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled to death. Later that day, around 5 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant Richard Carter was carefully sorting through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits' laundry room. For the past half an hour, he and his team had been scouring the crime scene for any possible clues, and now he was holding 2 white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots. They looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and told him to bag the towels as evidence. He couldn't be sure yet that the blood even belonged to Charlotte, but if it did, it could be a very important clue. After searching the entire house, Carter actually had a pretty strong theory about what had happened to Charlotte. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. The television and other valuables were all still in their proper places. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but all of her cash and her credit cards were still inside her wallet. So Carter did not think this was a simple robbery gone wrong. He thought that maybe the killer had just dumped out the purse at the very end to try to make it seem like a robbery, but it was a very weak attempt. This did not look like a robbery at all. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard a commotion coming from near the front door. He went to go see what was going on, and he saw a man out on the doorstep who was literally being physically held back by two of his forensics officers. After a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside to prevent him from seeing the scene, but Barry pushed right past them. And right away, he saw what they were trying to keep him from seeing. He saw his wife's body lying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze in place and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently grabbed Barry's arm and led him into the next room. He sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't catch his breath. Barry was gasping for air and was really struggling to breathe. Then he actually doubled over and clutched at his chest. Carter thought for a second that he might be having a heart attack. So, instead of trying to talk to him, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Carter stepped into the lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked if he could see Barry Waits. But the nurse told him he would have to wait. They were still running tests on Barry, and he couldn't have any visitors until they were absolutely sure that he was stable. Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this, not because he was desperate to get in there and console the grieving mayor. It was because he needed to talk to the mayor. As the spouse of a potential murder victim, he needed to know what Barry knew as soon as possible. So, he turned to leave. But before he did, he noticed two young women sitting in the waiting room. One of them was Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather. Carter and Heather had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day, when she was the one who came running out and directed him inside. They had talked a little bit, but Carter thought to himself, you know what? If I can't talk to Barry right now, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough that we could have a real conversation. And so, he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up, and she definitely recognized who he was. She sort of gave off body language that it was okay for him to come and sit down. And so Carter walked over and sat down next to her. He saw that there was another girl, a teenager, sitting next to Heather. Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said that this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara. Then he asked both of them how their dad was doing. Heather explained that so far, the doctors believed he was not having a heart attack, that it was most likely a severe panic attack. But they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed incredibly upset. They had tears in their eyes, and they both appeared to be in a state of shock. They hadn't really done anything suspicious, but Carter knew he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet. He had to ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them what they knew. By this point, Carter's officers had already learned that Charlotte had left her work around 11 o'clock that morning. It wasn't until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon that her coworkers had called her house because she hadn't come back to the office. They said there was no answer. And so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. With that timeline in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they had been during that specific window of time. Kara told him that she had been babysitting all day, and Heather said she had been at her college, which was 30 miles away, until around 4 o'clock that afternoon, when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother or who might have wanted to hurt her. The girls immediately shook their heads and said, "Absolutely not. There was no one. Their mom was wonderful and everybody seemed to like her." They insisted they were just a happy, normal family with no major issues that they knew of. Carter jotted all of this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughters' alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct, debriefing with the other investigators who were assigned to Charlotte's case. He had listened to the local news on the radio while he was driving to work that morning. And since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was all anybody in town could talk about. Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case quickly. By this point, he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out completely. Neither of the daughters could have been at the house between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects. Now, the other officers were going around the room, basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned all of Charlotte's neighbors and her coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, none of that had led to any new suspects. Another point of frustration was that the one person who likely would be able to help them the most, at least at this early stage in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband, but he was still in the hospital and was not being allowed to speak to the police. But just as Carter and the other officers were sort of scratching their heads, wondering what their next move was going to be, the front door of the precinct opened. And who walked in but Barry Waits himself? A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting in Carter's office. Barry said he had just been released from the hospital. They had determined that his heart was fine and that he had indeed just had a severe panic attack. So, as soon as he was out of the hospital, he had come right over to the police station to see what he could do to help with the investigation. Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day that Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say that he had left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barbershop had been closed, so he had gone right back to work. And he had stayed there until around 4:30, when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter Heather, telling him their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter was primarily just looking at Barry's hands and his arms. He was looking for any scratches or cuts or bruises. The running theory, based on what they had seen at the crime scene, was that Charlotte had put up a fight against her attacker before she was killed. And so presumably there should be wounds of some kind on the attacker, most likely on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, he could see no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple, and he seemed very earnest about it and eager to help. So, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was telling the truth and that he wasn't a suspect. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was being honest. At some point, Carter shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said yes, he did. He said there were actually two people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He explained that the first person was a guy named Dave Reed, who was their daughter Kara's boyfriend. He said that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was a bad influence, but the teens had kept sneaking around, and eventually Dave had gotten Kara pregnant. So Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over to the house to sort of confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things had gotten out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem for Charlotte. Barry explained that his wife and her cousin, Wayne, were in the middle of this contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said, Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys on the very same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up straight in his chair. He thought to himself that the timing here could not possibly be a coincidence. The cousin was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station, and he sat down across the table from two people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had responded by saying he would not say a single word without his lawyer present. And this had immediately made Carter pretty suspicious. During that very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he leaned right in and started to grill him. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family, but he swore that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. In fact, he claimed she had been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that. Wayne said that the last time he spoke to Charlotte, she seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had said she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all the land for herself just wasn't worth the conflict. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised. Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option on the table. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he had literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch that day, which was something he typically did. He insisted he was at work, truly, all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several of his coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. Wayne immediately looked over at his attorney. His attorney gave him a slight nod. And so Wayne looked back at Carter and said, "Okay." Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish. He just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there. When Carter asked him if he knew why he had been called to the station in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, "Yeah, I do." He had heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew that given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was completely absurd. Carter just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents. Dave admitted that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him. But Dave insisted he would never hurt Charlotte or Barry for that matter. And he hadn't even been in town the day that she was killed. He had been at work all day, at a landscaping job miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi, and he also asked him to provide his fingerprints. Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, "You're wasting your time," but he agreed to do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk, flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had initially thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the two long strings that were dangling from her neckline and had used them to strangle her to death. She had also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist. This level of violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the physical evidence seemed to paint a different picture. There were 3 sets of fingerprints that had been found at the crime scene. 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise at all because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was unidentified. And it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So, at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. To make matters worse, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well. So, truly, his list of suspects was basically down to 0. If Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was still the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt a sense of dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls basically every single day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down. Carter and his team had to take valuable time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just rumors and wild conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they'd looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but he had an airtight alibi. They had also investigated another local man who had strangled his girlfriend in a way that was similar to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had an alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had bragged at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out that this criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get him in trouble. Adding to the confusion, their fingerprint expert had told Carter that the third unidentified set of prints found at the scene could possibly belong to a child, and so it might be totally unrelated to the murder. So now, as Carter looked over at the desk sergeant who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just had, Carter just braced himself for more bad news, because all these tip calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was indeed more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress in the investigation. As difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to all the pressure he was feeling that locals were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, he also understood their frustration. He was feeling just as upset as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends, he was completely out of ideas. And he had a sinking feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold. Fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the investigation had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to move on without any sort of closure. Kara had her baby, and Heather had graduated from college and was working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much involved in local politics. In fact, just the previous year, he had run for a term on the city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife Charlotte. And even though he had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the bizarre fact that he had a dream about it, all the media attention from these accusations had totally reinvigorated the case. And calls had once again begun flowing into the tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these tips were just wild theories and local gossip. But on that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up Carter's office door, Carter looked up and saw that the sergeant was visibly excited. Whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him what he had heard, the desk sergeant said he had just spoken to 2 tipsters who clearly had some real information that they wanted to share, information that was going to blow this case wide open. Based on that crucial tip, the forensic evidence and new witness testimony, this is what police believe actually happened to Charlotte Waits on the 4th of August, 1998. Around 11:30 in the morning, the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house, and right away, they recognized Charlotte's car parked in the garage. When they saw it, their heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety because they hadn't been sure that she would even be home. But clearly, the killer had arrived at just the right time. So they parked their car at the end of the driveway, they walked up into the open garage, and they went over to the interior door that led into the house. They tried the handle and found that it was unlocked. So they opened it up. The killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away they heard footsteps on the second floor. They knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home at this time of day. The killer quietly closed the door behind them. They went around to the stairs that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them standing there. Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them. The killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank. And when she answered the question, it was not what the killer wanted to hear. So, the killer tried to get her to change her mind to answer this question differently. But the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. And then, the killer just totally lost their temper and hit Charlotte hard across the face. Blood immediately began pouring from Charlotte's nose. Stunned, she just stepped back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with it. At this point, the killer knew they had crossed a line. Persuading Charlotte to do what they wanted was now clearly out of the question. This was a point of no return. So, as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with a towel pressed to her face, looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind. They clutched the long strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight around her neck. Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, but the killer had her in an unbreakable chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her down the staircase. When the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte at the base of the stairs, motionless and very likely dead, the reality of what had just happened finally hit them. In a panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped on the floor. They rushed down the stairs and quickly cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face, and then they dumped the towels in the laundry room. Then they grabbed Charlotte's purse off a nearby table and scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping the police would think this was just a robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's mayor and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. Barry had secretly gotten himself into a lot of debt, and he needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it all off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and confronted Charlotte, asking her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and split the inheritance. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped. He killed his wife. Not just because he was mad at her for her decision, but also because he desperately needed more money. He was thinking, okay, I'm only going to get half of this inheritance because she's giving the other half to Wayne. But if I kill her, I'll also get her life insurance policy, and then together I'll have enough to pay off my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim, because Barry was clearly a suspect in his wife's murder early on in the investigation, the company refused to pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money directly to their daughters, Heather and Cara. But a couple of years later, Barry still tried to get his hands on that money by tricking his own daughters into signing it over to him. But when Heather and Cara realized what he was doing, they finally saw their father for what he truly was. And so, it was the daughters who were the tipsters who broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior, along with his clear financial motives for the murder. They also said that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police and had even called in fake tips himself to redirect attention away from him. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.